Welcome to the Table Podcast, where we discuss issues of God and culture, brought to you by Dallas Theological Seminary.
Now, you're making a point, and this is where we're going next, about, well, in first century Israel, this is not going to be an issue that comes up. But if we go to the larger Greco-Roman world, and we think about what's going on in Hellenistic culture around which the Christians, who of course early on were mainly Jewish, where they're coming from, what is the situation that we're dealing with in the larger Greco-Roman culture?
Well, generally, they would have viewed things quite a bit different. I think that's one of the problems that we actually have here. They would not have defined things as heterosexual, homosexual, etc. They would have seen it much more as who the active person is, who the passive person is in these types of things. And only certain people could be in those particular roles. For example, and this would have differed to some extent in various places, but first century, a Roman male citizen could only be an active individual, whereas a woman really could only be a passive individual. And for them to break those molds or break those roles, that would be very difficult and challenge really the whole structure of their society. In addition to women, you could have slaves, both male and women, men and women that could be passive. And most prominently, and probably most difficult for us to really wrestle with, is it could often be boys as well. Usually they wouldn't be citizens, especially in Rome. You would not have had that. But would not have been uncommon. It would have been quite expected in many cases. And go ahead.
So this is going on more or less regularly in certain pockets of the society. Is that a fair way to say it?
You'd pretty much, if you're looking at a guy who's got a home with an attractive adolescent slave boy, chances are it would be likely, at least in your mind, that they were having some type of relation in that respect. This does actually intersect the Gospels a little bit.
Okay. And
it has been brought up. The centurion who comes to Jesus with his slave to be healed, it is quite possible that there would have been a relationship there. And because Jesus does not condemn any activities they're doing, it's sometimes suggested that he's actually affirming one of these same-sex relationships. I think that misses a bit of the point of what's actually going on, but you actually see this argued on occasions. And Jesus is more interested in what he's actually doing, more interested in the personality of the boy. And there's a lot, I remember the welfare of the servant, etc.
Interesting. So what we have in Hellenistic culture is not so much these kinds of hardline categories about what can be done, because almost anything's being done in some ways.
Certain things aren't.
Yeah.
Again, I guess behind closed doors and nobody knows about, I'm sure everything can be going on. But this stuff is interrelated with the structure of society, with honor and shame culture, with the role of women, and really a really low view of women in light of what we think of today in many cases. The patronage system, this idea of controlling individuals, this all is tied up. It's not a separate category of sexuality.
So status is more important,
yes,
and function is more important than gender per se. Is
right.
That be fair to say?
Yes, yeah.
Okay. Now, having said that, and this is I've set this up on purpose as talking about what's going on with Jews and Judaism and what's going on in Rome and the Greco-Roman world, we come to Romans 1, which is obviously probably the most discussed text in the New Testament on this topic, a significant text in which Paul is engaged in why the nations are in need of the gospel. In a very generic kind of way, he'll turn his attention to the Jews in chapter 2. But in chapter 1, verse 18, down to the end of the chapter, in verse 32, we're in the midst of a discussion about the state of the world among the nations and how they have exchanged the Creator for the creature, and are engaged in a life and in elements of lifestyle that show their distance from God. It's very, very important that in all of these discussions that we are having, the presence of God and the honoring of God are very much in the background of all these passages. We do not live in a secularized world in which God is an optional player. He's very much present, and how we interact with him is a part of this discussion. Jay, why don't you take us through these key verses in Romans, and let me get them before we start. I'm going to get this on the iPad so I can read it, and then we'll discuss these verses. I'm going to start in verse 24. Therefore God gave them over in the desires of their hearts to impurity, to dishonor their bodies among themselves. They exchanged the truth of God for a lie, and worshipped and served the creation rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. For this reason, verse 26, God gave them over to dishonorable passions, for their women exchanged the natural relations for unnatural ones. And likewise the men also abandoned natural relations with women, and were inflamed in their passions for one another. Men committed shameless acts with men, and received in themselves the due penalty for their error. And just as they did not see fit to acknowledge God, God gave them over to a depraved mind to do what should not be done. They were filled with every kind of unrighteousness, wickedness, covetousness, malice. They are rife with envy, murder, strife, deceit, hostility. They are gossips, slanderers, haters of God, insolent, arrogant, boastful, contrivers of all sorts of evil, disobedient to parents, senseless, covenant breakers, heartless, and ruthless. And we've gone on to read, because the point here is the entirety of the condition of sin in the nations. And then verse 32, although they fully know God's righteous decree that those who practice such things deserve to die, they not only do them, but also approve of those who practice them. So that's our passage. What does it tell us?
Well, the final section that you mentioned there tells you this is pretty serious, because they're worthy of death. Mm-hmm. So this is not a casual offense or set of problems. So it's very serious, and in some way mimics what was going on in the Old Testament, where you had the capital offense. But probably more to the point is up around verse 26. And here it looks like a divine judgment for idolatry. In verse 25, they exchanged the truth of God for a lie, and worshipped and served the creature rather than Creator. And therefore, as a consequence, or for this reason, God gives them over to these degrading passions, exchanging normal, if I can use the word, normal heterosexual relations for same-sex relations. So this is a part of the divine judgment for idolatry.
So this becomes an illustration of one sin among many sins that leave the nations culpable before God.
Exactly.
And so when we come to verse 32, and we say those who practice such things deserve to die, it wouldn't be fair to say we're only talking about what's discussed in verse 27. We would be saying, no, Paul's condemnation extends to the entirety of the list, because in part he's building the case on why everyone needs to have their relationship with God restored, as opposed to only certain people who engage in certain particular practices. Would that be fair?
I think it would be fair. He does, it's a little expansive there when he talks about same-sex relations, but I'm not sure one could probably make a big distinction in terms of one's ultimate culpability before God in terms of the other sins. Malice and gossip and slanders and haters, those are all make one culpable. But so I'm not sure you can list these sins as one more grievous than the other. They're all damning, if you will. But anyway, the penalty, I think, would extend, that is, of deserving death, would include the whole list, all the way from verses 24.
And we're talking about a backdrop in which the deserving of death talks about being spiritually separated from God and having the need now to come into a restored life, which, of course, the rest of the book is about, in talking about how what Jesus has done and the sacrifice that he's done covers all these sins, can remove the guilt and the culpability before God, and can bring us into a state where we're reconciled with God. Would that be
Exactly
fair?
right. Exactly right.
Now, let's go back up to the passage in question and say, are there any limitations on what's going on here, or well, let me ask one previous question. Is there any doubt about what's being described here?
I don't think so. I think there is some sort of a same-sex relation. Occasionally, there's some talk that what Paul has in mind is some sort of a degrading or exploitive relationship, particularly with men with boys, and that's what he's opposed to. But then when he talks about women with women, he seems to be it's a broader category. It's not just an exploitive relationship with an adult male and an underage boy. Mm-hmm. It would certainly include that, but I don't think you can restrict it to that. As soon as he starts talking, he brings women in, you can see that his purview is a little wider than just exploitive relationships.
And go ahead.
It is worth pointing out that women and women would have been a big taboo, generally speaking. Now, again, it probably happened, and there's some things out there, but generally the sources don't talk as much about it definitely not in the same way as you have it with men with adolescents and younger boys. But so that would be right there something that probably most everyone would have agreed with at that point. Maybe that's a way of him getting into the argument, one of those things that people will accept.
So he's starting with, in some ways, the most grievous category, or the one that everyone accepts as a taboo, and then works his way to the places that might be more culturally debated.
Yeah, because women with women would mean somebody would have to take a role of a man.
Mm-hmm. And so, I look at this passage in verse 26 where it says, "For the women exchanged natural sexual relations for unnatural ones." That kind of removes any doubt about what it is that we're talking about. Is that fair to say, in terms of in terms of we're dealing with same-sex scenarios?
Yes, but I will say that some of the arguments that are brought up about this would be, well, what is natural? And then it goes to this idea, yes, it's true, it's natural for you who are attracted to women to be attracted to women. It would be unnatural for you to be attracted to a man. But for somebody who is actually a male attracted to other males, that's perfectly natural. And then with that type of a situation, it would actually be unnatural for a guy with desires for other men to actually try to, have relations with a woman in that case. I just find that's a little bit too complicated for a first-century audience, which does seem to be dealing with acts.
Ask the question: does in those discussions, and I'm going to be very delicate here, does physical design, anatomical design enter into that discussion in terms of what's natural and what isn't?
To some extent, yes, but it's actually quite fascinating because, and it's rather complicated too. We can make a distinction between sexuality, which is my desire for a specific person, and then gender identity, which is what I choose to be. So foreseeably, I was going to say you, but let's just say a particular man could identify himself gender-wise as female. And that particular man may have, if he's attracted to women, he is actually expressing lesbian desires. And so it's very complicated. Like I say, I just can't impose that type of a system upon
what you're saying
the
is,
world.
just to be clear, is what you're saying is the way this conversation comes across in modern conversation about the situation has more, it's working with more categories and more ways to think about it from a psychological point of view, et cetera. And to think that that would be something that would enter into the mind of someone who's writing in the first century, who's writing about these things, is unlikely.
There's some philosophical discourse going on with the way people were created and split apart, and these desires actually happening. But again, for that on a more common level would, to me, seem very difficult to sustain.
Would it be fair to say that in the ancient world, and this is the generalization, but we'll go for it and see what happens. Would it be fair to say that generally speaking, ancients thought more concretely about some of these issues in the sense of the way in which we are physically designed is designed to be a picture of the way we're to think about the creation?
Yeah, as long as we keep it in that context that they aren't working off our paradigm.
Right.
For them, the active and passive is what's important. The roles are what's important. But again, concrete may seem to imply they weren't into as much abstract thought. But the way this is worded, women with women, men with men, they might not have been thinking specifically the acts as in the forefront. Maybe they were, but they also would have been thinking, well, women with women. That breaks social convention. And so if that's what you mean by concrete, yes.
Yeah. Well, actually, no, that's not what I mean by concrete. What I'm suggesting is the very anatomical design, the idea that says that there are some people who are designed one way and some people are designed another, and so I'm trying to do this delicately, the coupling reflects the oneness, okay, in very concrete terms. That's natural. That's designed.
It breaks down, though, because me as a citizen male, I can only be active. But a male slave can be passive.
So in other words, the function, you can think about functioning in a different role, but one more question then. Was this seen, let's take right or wrong out of it, but and put it in a different form. Was it seen to be a different kind of relating, if I can say it that way? Would there be a distinction made in what was going on, or would it simply be taken on equal moral terms? Again, remembering that we're talking about how Romans think about this.
Well, yeah, definitely, and that's probably worth bringing up because on the one hand, you could be, again, hypothetically, and again, I want to make it clear that you were going to talk about Athens 4 centuries earlier, it'd be slightly different, talk about different things, but generally speaking, I'm trying to go with a first century Roman idea that that you would go and as long as you were doing what you functioned and the way you functioned, that was acceptable. And trying to think how I would want to word that in another way, but
well, let me take it this way. But a Jewish person looking at that,
right?
Would they look at it the same way?
No, and I think Paul's using a Jewish polemic here.
He's talking
against
about
the Roman world,
the creator and the creature. I mean, there's a divine intent here. There's a Genesis overlay, I think, to what Paul's doing.
Or Leviticus overlay.
The
Torah overlay.
And when he talks about something being against nature, I think it means, or in line with nature, it's in line with the Creator's intent. Genesis 2 kind of intent. Now, a Roman might say that I have a underage boy and that he's the passive partner. That's not against nature, the way we define it.
Right. But let me go back. I think I know what I want to answer now with that question. A person could be, let's say he's a 20-year-old and he's interested, or maybe a 25-year-old interested in young boys or going and I want to say young adolescent type boys. But that does not preclude that he's going to get married and have what we would consider heterosexual relations from here on out. They seem to be able to separate maybe what's involved in marriage and what they're going to do and what a good citizen does and what maybe they do before marriage, etc.
So the point here is, and we have spent a lot of time on this on purpose, not to park here, but to really get the cultural elements of what's going on. This is culturally very much a cross-cultural engagement to a certain degree. You've got something going on in Rome and in Hellenism on the one hand that is culturally constructed one way. You've got something going on in the Jewish world and theologically that's constructed in a different way, and you are seeing them run into each other in this passage. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah, in fact, I think that's why this is so important. This passage is so important for me. This is the one passage I think that really makes the point. Because it's easy when you're looking at something and everything's going one particular way in the culture for somebody to just affirm it and go on. It's hard to say whether or not there's a critique going on. But in the Roman culture, men with other males was an accepted thing. So for Paul to actually be drawing upon this, he's not just taking I've just grown up as as a heterosexual, if you will, and I know everything else is wrong, like we might do today. He was in a culture that was dominated by this active-passive, male could be with males, etc., in certain situations. And then he applies this text, or a Jewish idea, to this. And we know Paul is not necessarily opposed to going against Jewish tradition in many things.
That's right.
But here he does affirm it. So to me, this is a strong evidence that what Paul's saying here, one, it's countercultural, at least to a Roman audience, and gives it, I think, a lot more staying power, if you will, in this argument.
So your point is that by appreciating the openness of the Roman culture and how freewheeling it was, if I can say it this way, it actually makes more of this passage than if it were like, well, this is everyone without thinking and blinking says, oh yeah, that's just unnatural.
Yeah, and to take an analogy with food, if Paul, came from a Jewish background and he doesn't eat pork, probably, and he has no problem saying we can eat various other things now. But if he took a passage and said, eating pork demonstrates that the Roman world is corrupt, it would seem to be that there's something important there, because he knows that everybody can go and get pork.
So just to drive the point home, the point that you're making in the end is that even though we're dealing with a cultural clash, the point that Paul is making is designed to be transcultural, that he's dealing with something that from the standpoint of God applies to cultures no matter what. And so this is part of the culpability that people have, because they have this kind of approach to things.
Yeah, and Paul's probably utilizing, he uses men and women here, uses the adjectives, would probably go back to Genesis to allude there. He doesn't say husband and wife. He says male and female. And again, that should echo in at least some readers' ears of that original creation.
If I can second what Joe said, and I think I'll try to. I don't think Paul defines this idea of functioning according to nature or not according to nature culturally. He's defining that in terms of the Old Testament, in terms of Genesis. That determines what's contrary to nature and with nature.
So according to creation, if you want to think of it that way.
Yes. And he also doesn't define it, which I think we do more commonly today, psychologically. Right. Psychologically, I am a woman caught in a man's body or something. I don't think Paul's defining functioning naturally in terms of psychological terms, where we might say, well, it's against my nature to play the role of a male, because I'm really a woman. I need, it's against nature for me to do that. I don't think Paul's thinking in terms of psychological categories. He's thinking in terms of creative categories and God's original intent, not in terms of how I view my makeup or my gender identity or sexual identity.
Okay, that I think we've worked our way through that passage. Let's go to the others. I'm going to pair a couple of passages because we're running long on time. And the two passages I want to pair are 1 Corinthians 6:9 and then 1 Timothy 1:10. What these two passages share is they both discuss issues in relationship to the presentation of vice lists of one kind or another. So I think we can pair them together and move in this kind of a way. I would say after the Romans passage, the second most cited text that we get in this discussion out of the New Testament is this 1 Corinthians 6:9 text. Again, I will read it out of the Net Bible, and I will just read with verse 9. Do you not know that the unrighteous will not inherit the kingdom of God? Do not be deceived. The sexually immoral, idolaters, adulterers, passive, and I'm going to pull the word homosexual here. It says homosexual partners, but passive partners and practicing partners, I'll read it that way, be the active partner. Thieves, the greedy, drunkards, the verbally abusive, the swindlers will not inherit the kingdom of God. Some of you once lived this way, but you were washed, you were sanctified, you were justified in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ and by the Spirit of our God. And then it goes on. Now, we've got, again, a vice list. I think it's fascinating that we always find this discussion not in isolation, but always tied to other conversations about other kinds of sin. And what we have here are two terms that I think we're going to have to talk about, malakoi and arsenokoites. So we've got two words here, one of which translates, I want to be very literal, soft, if you want to think of it that way, and the other of which literally is the combination of two words, male and bed, okay? Just to show you the difference between the terms. I actually think that in this case, thinking literally about what the word pictures are helps you to understand sort of what the words are getting at. So in one case, in the picture of the soft, I've got what is translated oftentimes as passive, the person who is not the active player. And in the other case, we've got the active or the dominant figure that's being described. So with that as the background, what does this passage have to tell us? And you teach 1 Corinthians, Jay, so you get this one since we picked on Joe last time. And tell us what's going on here.
Well, the first thing I'd want to mention is what you'd said. You know, you have another list. Mm-hmm. And interesting, I think for the third time in the list, you get a very severe punishment or threat. You will not inherit the kingdom of heaven. Or is it the kingdom of God?
Yeah.
But at any rate, the point still stands. I mean, violators, this is very serious. And probably the second thing I would say is this is in a list. Oftentimes the discussion goes about inclination or psychological makeup. These terms are in a passage where there's a lot of behavioral, active sort of phenomena. You know, you're a drunkard, you're a coveter, you're a viler, you're a swindler. It's in a list of actions. So I'm not sure Paul's really talking about some sort of psychological makeup of individuals.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that the word that comes before the two terms that we're discussing is the word adulterer. And I know that in some of the blog exchanges I've had on this issue with people who are defending same-sex lifestyle in one way or another, and they're making the psychological point, well, I'm made this way, or I have an inclination in this direction. You know, I like to make the point, well, I may have an inclination that I'm quite capable of thinking about having sex with other women. You know, I may have that inclination, but that doesn't mean I act on that inclination, and that or that gives me the right to act on that inclination. And so this is a case where I think the nature of the lists may help us think through what it is that's being dealt with in the Scripture. And what's being dealt with in the Scripture is playing out on the inclination or acting on the inclination, as opposed to simply being in a certain place emotionally or having a certain kind of proclivity. I think many of us have proclivity. I mean, I think of Jesus' passage on the Sermon on the Mount where he talks about, you know, it's not adultery, it's lust that's the problem. Well, that nails most of us. And so, and what he's showing is the standard that says the heart that is really aligned with God does so in a way that that doesn't just simply say, well, I have this inclination, so I have the right or the entitlement to go there, but it thinks through how I deal with inclinations that I may have. Joe, you have anything you want to add to the 1 Corinthians 6 passage?
Well, again, I think these are real difficult to pinpoint what terms mean in these types of lists. Romans 1 is so much easier because there's description going on. But again, I think sometimes our translations will seem like they're coming from, again, our modern perspective of hetero-homosexual breakup, and they'll see passive with the malakoi, passive receptors, and then active on the other term. And I just want to add a couple things. One, I think from the ancient perspective, it might be a little easier to see the soft translation. I like the effeminate translation because the Romans were very, very opposed to men who would do things that look like a woman. That was very negative. And of course, that would include taking a passive role. But it was more than that.
So this is a broad term, is your point?
Right.
Yeah, just like the analogy I like to use here is the term porneia is a broad term for sexual immorality. It can cover a lot of things, but it covers adultery.
Yep.
I mean, but it's more than that.
Yeah.
Now, if you like contra, I might push back on Joe a little bit.
Okay.
Well, let me finish one.
All right,
but I also like this translation a little bit better, too, because if you say passive homosexual, again, passive same-sex partner, you're primarily talking about, younger people, younger boys. Boys, about the start of adolescence to a little bit up to a start of puberty.
You're
up
certainly
to adolescence.
including that group,
and that would be the what you'd be thinking of. I would think normally when you're talking about this group of individuals, and I just don't see in that case as well as them really being able to have much to do in some of these cases, especially if they were, a slave boy or something like that. And so a category that is primarily directed at a powerless group I find to be problematic. And again, I think from the perspective of the ancient world, that would have been a little bit more understandable because they aren't making both those distinctions like we are.
Jay?
Well, I appreciate that. I'm just in being paired with the two terms, the malakos, the soft, and the arsenokoites, the man better. I tend to think them. It's likely, in my thinking, they're being used together.
They're paired.
They're paired. Now, perhaps not, but
Yeah.
I kind of favor some of the recent translations that will not define those two terms individually, but will translate them something like men who have sex with men. And they're not isolating the two terms.
They're rendering both of them with that phrase.
Yeah.
Again, I see this as a natural homosexual, heterosexual distinction way to translate it.
Yeah.
Because we're coming from it. That's the way we're viewing this thing. And so, naturally, how do these fit? And then it comes in. Again, I don't see that as valid in the ancient world. Mm-hmm. And I will note that other word is really difficult to translate, men betters. Mm-hmm. In fact, I just want to clarify, because it's easy for us to be accused of an etymological fallacy or something here. Because,
very much so.
peanut, well, I guess something like, understand has nothing to do with under, has nothing to do with stand, butterfly, and but in this case, I would like to defend the translation, although it might be intentionally ambiguous. That we don't know if it's active or passive by men betters. We assume it's active, but it could be both ways. It's not a very commonly used word. It first appears around this time. Some may even think it first appears by Paul, but there's again with limited data, we don't know, but. In light of that limited data, and in light of these types of terms, like man and bed, bringing them together, I do think there is some justification for doing this type of thing methodologically, despite the fact that I think we need to be careful and sensitive to issues of exegetical fallacies, if you will.
I think it's interesting to note that the Net Bible, in translating this in particular, has managed to put notes for each one of these terms. So it shows you the nature of the issue. I think that it's important, again, to put this in the context of the larger point. This is part of a larger vice list in which many things are being mentioned, and all of them are acts that are being sanctioned and critiqued and rebuked by Paul in this context,
and given hope for too. In verse 11, and such were some of you, but you were washed, you were sanctified, you were justified.
Yeah, the whole point is that, again, as we saw in Romans, if we were to have read on in Romans, this can all be overcome and transformed and impacted by what it is that Jesus is able to do for us. Okay, let's go to the 1 Timothy passage, the 1 Timothy 1, and then we have one more passage after that. So 1 Timothy 1 in verse 10, And again, we've got our terms here. Let me get this in context. It says, verse 8, "But we know that the law is good if someone uses it legitimately, realizing the law is not intended for a righteous person, but for lawless and rebellious people, for ungodly and sinners, for the unholy and the profane, for those who kill their fathers or mothers, for murderers." This has been rendered sexually immoral people, the term here, and the term here that we've got is a fused term, if I can say it that way. Sexually immoral people, practicing homosexuals, kidnappers, liars, perjurers, in fact, for any who live contrary to sound teaching. So we have the immoral in general to start off verse 10, and then we have our term coming back that we saw in 1 Corinthians 6:9, the second term of the two that we were talking about earlier when we had the soft, and then whatever we do with the male betters to keep the term fairly literal here.
And just if I can jump in real quick, those are the two terms. I mean, those two terms that have been combined here are the two terms used in the two Leviticus texts
In the Greek, yeah.
Yeah, but they're separated in Leviticus. Now I say that, of course, Leviticus is written in Hebrew, but when it's translated
into the
Greek,
Septuagint, what we call the Septuagint, the Greek Old Testament translation, which is an ancient translation.
It uses those two words separately both times. It uses them in Leviticus 18, and then it uses them both again in Leviticus 20, and then in the Corinthians text and in the Timothy text, they're combined. They're pulled together.
So your point, I take it is that it could well be that the term that we're getting here for the actions being described is alluding back to Leviticus 18 and Leviticus 20?
I think almost certainly.
Okay.
This seems to be, Paul likes to, Dr. Fantin over there.
I'm not saying anything.
He's pushing back on it. But Paul loves this section of Leviticus, and he likes to use it. And this, by most people's count, this is the first time this one particular word's used. And a lot of people propose, and I think with some fairness, that Paul's coined the term here. Coming out of Leviticus, he's pulled these two terms together and coined a new phrase based on the use of Leviticus.
And we see him using in 1 Corinthians, and then we see him using in 1 Timothy, and we won't get into a discussion. It's another podcast on who's the author of 1 Timothy is. So we'll because some people would say, well, this isn't Paul, this is the Pauline school or whatever, but we're aware of that. There's no doubt that this is the same term being used in a fairly similar kind of way, really, in relationship to 1 Corinthians. Whatever you're going to do with 1 Corinthians 6 is likely what you're going to do with 1 Timothy 1. We're in a vice list. We're in the same kind of situation. We're in a law righteousness context, etc. So we're doing much of the same things in the two passages. Fair?
Yeah, fair. Definitely.
Okay. One more passage, and this is outside of Paul. Now we're in Jude, chapter 7. I guess it's appropriate to end up here in many ways because it takes us, by going to Jude, we're going to go back to Sodom at the same time. So we get to kind of circle the wagons in our discussion. Jude 7 is in a context in which a list of sins that God has judged are being presented. Verse 5 of Jude. "And now I desire to remind you, even though you've been fully informed of these facts once for all, that Jesus, having saved the people out of the land of Egypt, later destroyed those who did not believe. You also know angels who did not keep their present domain, but abandoned their own place of residence. He is kept in eternal change and utter darkness, locked up for the judgment of the great day." That's the second sin. And now we come to the Sodom and Gomorrah. "So also Sodom and Gomorrah and the neighboring towns, since they indulged in sexual immorality and pursued unnatural desire in a way similar to these angels, are now displayed as an example by suffering the punishment of eternal fire." And the description here is actually rather generic in terms of the language that's used. So really, all we're doing is alluding to Sodom and Gomorrah and basically saying, well, whatever was wrong and what happened at Sodom and Gomorrah, that's what God judged and dealt with. So that was a situation when we discussed it that we said, well, this is actually a complicated situation. This is a forced forced rape situation, and so it's not quite in the same category as some of these other passages that we've ended up talking about. Fair?
Yeah, I hate to say it, but I kind of like the what the Queen James does here a little bit. Not necessarily the translation, but I see a similarity with what Hebrews does with some of the Old Testament passages. I don't think this is necessarily a grammatical historical discussion of the Genesis text like you would have done, but just as Hebrews notes that Abraham is going to offer Isaac, but believes he's going to be resurrected, which you can't really get from the Hebrew text very well. I think here he uses just this other flesh. Readers would know that these individuals were angels, and therefore maybe what they were looking back at was this relationship where almost species crossing taking place here. And I don't think the text itself has necessarily always been used in same-sex context anyway.
So this is another one. We've gone through passages and we've said, well, Genesis 9 really doesn't belong in the database in this discussion in many ways. The Genesis 19 operates on the edge because it's a particular kind of forced situation. And here Jude is just alluding back in a general way to that, and he's using the cross species development as a part of the equation. So that ends up being a complicated text as well. So when we boil it all down, what we end up with are 3 or 4 central passages on this particular conversation, and that would be the Leviticus 18:22, the Leviticus 20:13, the Romans 1:26 through 32, and the 1 Corinthians 9 passages.
Yeah.
Those are really the 4 texts out of the 8 that relate to this conversation in a way where the other factors aren't so complicated that we can't know whether those texts relate to the conversation or not. Fair enough?
Fair enough.
Well, gentlemen, we've certainly spent some time in these texts, and we hope that the walk through these passages has been helpful in using the backdrop of how someone coming at it from a completely different angle would engage the topic has been a helpful way in to think about how to talk about these passages. We appreciate you all listening in with us and listening to the passage, and we thank you for being at the table with us again, and we hope to have you back soon. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Table Podcast. Dallas Theological Seminary. Teach truth, love well.